So we're thrilled to have Eliana La Ferrara with us today. Eliana is a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and until recently, the president of the Econometric Society, among many other roles in the economic profession. So Eliana's work has been instrumental in both political economy and development economics, and as I said, for social sciences more broadly. I also want to emphasize that her contribution goes beyond academia only. Her work has helped evaluate and design new development policies around the world. And so today, we're thrilled to learn about her new work on harmful norms and how misperceptions and coordination failure can help explain why such norms still persist today. So Eliana, the floor is yours. You have, let's say, until 25, so 95 minutes. And Eliana told me that questions throughout are fine, so we don't need to wait the end for questions. You can just raise your hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Clemence, for the very generous introduction. And it's really great for me to be here. I should say away from this, to be here and see colleagues, friends, and even some former students, because in my previous life, I used to be at Bocconi, and there are some former students in our program here. And I want to say to the prospective students that if you don't like what you see today, don't hold it against UCLA. It's a great place you should join. Just I take full responsibility. So this is joint work with Pedro Ferreira, Céline Gouleshi, David Snerdon, and Monshi Sunna. And it's part of a research agenda I've been working on for the past few years on norms change, and in particular on harmful gender norms in low-income settings. This paper in particular is on female genital cutting in Somalia. And these norms, you know, we have people here who've really been pillars in the research on gender, labor markets. These norms really negatively affect women's well-being and still persist long-term in many societies. We know research on child marriage, marriage payments, restrictions to women mobility, female labor force participation. The norm that I focus on today is, if anything, even harder to rationalize because there is hardly any benefit and there are very serious health costs. It's the practice of cutting or removing part of the female genitalia for non-medical reasons. It affects over 200 million women in the world, and every year it's estimated that about 4 million girls are at risk. And it's typically performed on girls between infancy and age 15, and it has serious health consequences, both at the time of cutting and later in life, which include, bleeding, infection, difficulty in delivering children, as well as higher risk of HIV and other infections. And yet, despite the fact that there have been campaigns and efforts by government to eradicate it, it's still quite persistent. So in this map, you see the prevalence of FGC across Africa. And the darker blue color corresponds to rates above 90%. Okay, so we have Somalia, Egypt, Sierra Leone, all in this range. And it's pretty, it's hard to rationalize, but it's also interesting to know that in all of these countries, except 3, there's a law against it. So this practice persists despite legal efforts to fight it. So we're going to be working in a setting where 99% of the women and girls aged 15 to 49 are cut, and where there's also an interesting dimension of a gradient almost in the severity of the practice, because there is a form of cutting that's called pharaonic circumcision locally, which is infibulation, or the most harmful type. But there's also a form in Somalia that's called Sunna, which clitoridectomy or excision, which is somehow intermediate. So it's not the absence, but it's not as harmful as pharaonic. And you will see, I will mention that these options of more or less invasive forms of cutting have played an interesting role in the evolution of the practice. In fact, if you look at the cohorts, we collected data so that retrospectively you could look at the type of cut depending on the year when you were cut. Up until the early 90s, basically every woman was cut with pharaonic. So it was the country with the highest prevalence of infibulation. And then you see a pretty sharp transition out of it, and Sunna instead replaces it. So we're still at almost universal cutting rates, but nowadays the girls that are cut are mostly cut with Sunna, okay? And so I have a different paper that tries to look into this transition, and I'll say a little bit about it later. But right now, for today's talk, we will be focusing on the more harmful type. There is a literature out there, yes.
Is this mostly among Muslims?
So that's a very good question, because the pharaonic one is not actually associated with religion, while Sunna is rationalized as complying with the teachings of Islam, although there's nothing in the Quran that really speaks about it. And in fact, many Islamic countries basically do not practice FGC. But in Somalia, when we asked about why it's done, we got different explanations depending on the type, and the religious one comes up when you talk about Sunnah, not when you talk about pharaonic, which is the one where we do the intervention. And in general, the rationale for why this practice exists is most often reconduced to signaling purity, maintaining virginity. So ideals of chastity and preserving chastity, and hence the potential benefits in terms of marriage markets. And again, while that's probably true in many contexts, in Somalia, when we asked, these marriage market motives weren't the first ones that people would bring up. So right in our study, we decided to focus on two alternative, not necessarily exclusive, explanation for the persistence. One is pluralistic ignorance, which is basically amounts to a setting where you have individuals who privately hold certain values. In particular, let's say that they might actually not want to cut their daughters, but they think that everyone else wants them to, and everyone else approves of the practice. In this case, people might continue doing it, even if they themselves individually are against it. And even if you took an average of these individual positions, you would get a majority in favor of abandoning. But because the beliefs are not rational, the practice persists. Then there has been work, a famous contribution on female labor force participation in Saudi Arabia, as well as other settings, where this pluralistic ignorance channel seems to be relevant, but nobody has tested it in the context of FGC. Also, in most of these social norm settings, there's coordination failure. So in this case, you could have even perfect knowledge of other people's position and perfectly rational beliefs. But if you start from an equilibrium where everybody's cutting, you might fear costs of unilaterally deviating, because you would be the first one to go against the current practice. And so you might be stuck there. So, we know the literature on tipping, which typically requires a significant mass of people to move from below to above the threshold. And some of the interventions that NGOs have proposed in this space are actually motivated by this idea of tipping. So we work to test the importance and the potential complementarity between these two types of explanations. We'll start by asking, are there misperceptions about support for the worst form of FGC in Somalia? If so, once we correct this misperception, that is, we reveal information about the true level of support, And once we give tools to potentially coordinate, does that help reducing the incidence of FGC? And also, does it make sense to address the misperception and the coordination together or not? Okay, so this is our goal. And to answer it, we worked with Save the Children to conduct, I just finished this and then we get you, to conduct a large-scale RCT with over 8,000 men and women across 141 communities. And basically, we held meetings in these communities where in a subset of villages, we addressed these misaligned beliefs. In another, we try to facilitate coordination through public declarations. And in the third, we combine the two. And I will be much more specific about how we did this, okay? Before I tell you the preview of the results, there was a question.
Maybe you're gonna address this in a little bit, but I'm interested in what the social sanctions are.
I don't have any specific in the slide, so it's good that. So we, right now, we don't have a hard measure of sanctions in the sense that in the pilot, when we did our pilot and we started asking, suppose that somebody, that a family decided not to cut their daughter, would they be able to borrow money if they needed it? So we started asking a bunch of questions about potential sanctions the way we envisioned them. And it didn't seem to really show that there would be punishments in terms of access to economic opportunities. Sanctions came up when we asked about how would this family, other families feel if somebody did this or that, and then people would say they would feel unhappy. And so, again, they didn't quite specify how they would punish. We can conjecture there might be some ostracism or, frowning upon, but in terms of exclusion from mutual insurance networks or transactions, when asked directly, and maybe we were not subtle enough in our way of asking the question, those didn't come up as explicit sanctions.
So as you go forward, can you that seems to be key to the second thing that you're trying to pass.
Yeah,
That there are sanctions, so.
yes.
So
I think what's key to what I'm gonna do is that there's an expectation of sanction. In the sense that you expect to be sanctioned, right? So maybe part of why it didn't come up is that the way we were trying to ask it to be factual was, do you know of families that have not cut their girls? And because we're in the setting where 99% cut, this was like a very tiny fraction of people who said yes. And then we said, what happened to them? And it's not like they said, oh, they got kicked out of the village. So when we are in the hypotheticals, these things come up. When we try to say, here's something that you observed and it was a sanction against this, partly because it's an out of equilibrium behavior, or partly because in these few cases nothing happened, we fail to capture it. But I think there is an understanding that this would go against the prevalent view of the community and that there would be unhappiness. In those questions, it shows up.
I mean, would your daughter be able to get married, for example?
So we
That's
did
what
ask that question, and then the answer is we're pretty much, I'm gonna be rough, but we have percentages. Without pharaonic, yes. Without Sunna, maybe not so much. Okay. So right now, because we are asking now, there's not so much support anymore for pharaonic. Mm-hmm. But with Sunna, the way we asked is what share of men would marry a girl without Sunna, and I think it's positive and meaningful, but it's less than 50%. So they would think that less than half of the male population would marry someone who's not cut at all.
Is that class-based as well? Like the people that you would most want your daughter to marry, would they be the ones most likely?
That we didn't check. because we just asked about expectations of men in this community. We can look at the socioeconomic status of the respondent and how their response varies with this.
I say that, it's just, it could be 50% overall,
Yeah.
but it could be
No, it's less
100%
than
of
that.
the men that you want
Yeah,
your.
and
child.
I think I have I could run to the table. I have a table where we do some robustness and where the marriage question comes up. And I have the number there. Sorry, I should remember.
Yeah, so just a very quick follow-up, but I think if you think your daughter isn't going to be able to get married, that's a pretty serious
Yeah.
sanction.
Yeah, but again, that question was, what share of men would marry? And we see a difference. There's still a positive fraction that people think would marry an uncut daughter. So eventually, are you among those who expect that they could get away with it or not? So there is, I agree with you, that is a sanction. We were trying to really get at the individual personal experience, at least through networks of these sanctions, and that comes up less. But okay, fair enough. Thanks. So in terms of results preview, we did find some degree of misperception on support for Pharaon. Okay, not for Sunna, that we investigated in the pilot, and in fact, that's why this correction intervention is done on the worst form. 2 years after the intervention, the villages where we corrected the misperception show belief updating, so people are now expecting less support for pharaonic, as well as a reduction of pharaonic by 40%, which is a huge share, but it's starting from a low baseline because pharaonic is now disappearing. So in terms of percentage point change, this you will see is not a large number, but in proportion it is a meaningful effect. On the other hand, when we simply went there and said, here's a group of people who might be willing to coordinate to do something, that by itself did not help. Okay, and I'll explain why. It has to do with the interplay of priors with this coordination tool, nor did we find evidence of complementarity, okay? The subset of communities where this coordination tool helped was those where people were already expecting enough support from others, and that expecting enough support made the tool work better, because you will see that the tool is somehow in itself manipulable depending on whether you support the practice or not.
So clarification, so in terms of the results, is all the decline just substitution towards Sunna then?
That's a very, very good question. It will be in the short run, okay? In the short run, you will see that pharaonic goes down, Sunna goes up. And, from a health perspective, it's still a gain. We have work that says that you should actually worry because there might be long-term consequences of being stuck in this intermediate stage, and I will mention it in a moment. But the reason why even empirically we are less worried now is that when you take into account the future plans for girls that are not yet of cutting age, so this cut you observe within 2 years for girls who are around 8, which is the average age at cutting, but girls who are younger, they were 0 and will stay 0 in our end line. But we did ask parents what they are planning to do. And once you take that into account, there's not a substitution. There's actually a decrease in cutting across the board and an increase in uncut. I'll talk about these plans and how reliable they are when I get to the table. But in the short run, there is this substitution. So in terms of contributions to the literature on Bayesian updating and pluralistic ignorance has looked at different settings, and we think it's important this says something about the settings where the stakes are pretty high. So you would expect that people would try to find out about where the rest of the community is. So it is somehow useful to show misperceptions in this setting. Also, when you look at coordination failure, aside from the very large theoretical literature and experimental lab evidence, there's very little, if anything, in the field. And so we wanted to try and think of how would it work if you were to think of policies to facilitate coordination. We went at it with a very blunt approach that you will see was probably oversimplistic. But again, in terms of research directions, I do think that this is one area when you work on norms where there is more scope for understanding how to facilitate coordination.
So is it a bit linked with the literature on people at the center of the network? So you target the village chief because they will be the one setting the tone. And so I feel it has the mix of information, but also coordination in the sense that you start with someone who might move enough people.
Yeah, so I think it should, and it would. The way we did it is not through networks, partly because we couldn't collect network data at the village level. We didn't have a budget or the capacity to do that. And also once we went into the meetings, we tried to be as hands-off as possible. So a limitation is that we will not know exactly who spoke up, who said what. There might have been a village elder or not in our meeting, and it would be very useful to know, but we've feared that being observed or recording this information might have changed the dynamics. I think after seeing the results from this research, and especially seeing how much support there is for Sunna and how much Sunna is associated with religion, I am convinced that if one wanted to reduce the prevalence of Sunna, there's no other way than to work with religious authority in the Somali context. For Pharaonic, which is what we were doing here, we did it slightly different, but I agree with you that it could be very important. I think Daron has some work on authorities and networks and norms change through that. Yeah, okay. So there's a broader literature on FGC as well as gender norms, to which we, also try to speak. Let me just try and move towards the experiment and the results, but I want to give you 2 slides of framework in terms of how these choices are typically modeled in the literature on social interactions. The seminal paper by Brock and Durloff basically gives you a setting where people have 2 choices. We can call it the low and the high action. And low would be cut, high would be not cut. And then there's a fraction of people that choose each of the 2 actions. And individual utility has 3 components. The first one is the utility that you get from action I that's independent of what everyone else does, okay? So if we think of the health costs, for example, those would go into this UI term. Then there's a component which depends on how many people are choosing actions that are different from the one you're doing. So if you're looking at I don't cut, you would basically pay a penalty for choosing that action that's higher, the higher the fraction of people who instead are cutting. And how much of a penalty you pay depends on this social parameter that says those who choose J impose a cost S on those who choose I, okay? So this parameter is basically how high that S is a measure of how strong perceived social pressure is. And this term is the one that creates the coordination in the multiple equilibria, because even though you might have this intrinsic utility preference for one or the other, eventually, if enough people are gonna sanction you, you might decide to go with the majority. And then there's an error term, okay? Now, these models have two key features. One is that as long as these conformity concerns are important enough, you're gonna have multiple equilibrium, okay? And that's what creates the need for coordination. But the other feature is that in the literature, this P is assumed to be rational, so that the expectation of how many choose an action and the actual share of those who choose an action would be assumed to coincide. But the whole point of pluralistic ignorance is that you might have beliefs that are not correct in equilibrium. So if you think that these inaccurate beliefs, that this expected P would not coincide with the actual P, that's where the channel of the misperception comes through. Now, in Somalia, this cut or not cut is not really the choice, because as we discussed, there's this intermediate option. And so with a subset of the co-authors and two others, we have a paper where we propose a model of transitions. It's actually called the stepping stone transition model. And in that question, we're asking whether when you have this intermediate option, it makes it easier or less easy to get away from the bad equilibrium. And the reason why it might make it easier is that for people who are reluctant to abandon the norm altogether, just having a substitute that's close enough would make them take the first step. And then maybe once you are at a milder form, at that point, the social costs from going to uncut are going to be smaller, and then you do the entire transition. But the reason why it may not instead be so helpful is that once you are in the intermediate stage, also the costs of staying there are going to be lower, because at that point, you're not paying these huge health costs. So what's your incentive to go all the way? So in that paper, we derive conditions on what parameters in terms of social sanctions, intrinsic utility, give rise to this stepping stone where you start from the bad, you transition towards the intermediate, but then eventually you go to uncut. Versus instead, the intermediate equilibrium becoming absorbing, so that you start from everybody cutting pharaonic, you move towards Sunna, but then you're stuck there, okay? And the only way to do uncut here would be to start close enough, okay? So there can be both options, and in part to what Adriana was asking, in the short run, we saw a movement along this line, but this movement could be consistent both with this and with that, okay? Now, if we believe their self-reports on what they plan to do, it would be more like, you know, maybe they're not going to uncut, but what we do in this other paper using data on the cohorts that we have observed is get some parameters that suggest that Sunna nowadays, that doesn't have any intervention. It's really more taking data on the various generations and seeing, well, you know, what from that transition path, what could we project going forward. And in that paper, it seems that Sunna is more of an absorbing state. Yes.
You want to go first and then I'll go?
I just wanted to ask a clarifying question
Yes.
about the setting. So if there is these ignorance, I guess it's because it's not observable if people are cut or not. So that was going to be my question. And again, I think in some places, everybody knows like this girl is like a big deal. Like they're doing this and a lot of people attend. So there would and it's a small village. So in those cases, you would actually know.
Yeah. So that's thank you. There are cases like Sierra Leone, for example, I know because I have another project there where this is an initiation ritual. A whole group of girls goes for a month in the bush. Everybody knows who's gone to the bush that year, so they know who's cut. In Somalia, no, it's done individually. The circumciser would come to your place. So in principle, Certainly, the circumcisers have incentives to have everybody get cut. And so if you don't get cut, they might say that they haven't cut you. Whether they come, you pay them, you strike a deal and they don't cut, that we can. But pretty much, again, the moment you then become, go for marriage, your husband would observe. So in settings where like this 98% or so of the people are cut, it's sort of really stands out if you choose to deviate. But it is not as observable as when it is a group ceremony. I agree. Yeah.
I suppose if 98% of the girls get cut, then my question becomes kind of irrelevant. But what I was thinking about is how many girl children who survive to cutting age does a typical Somali mother have? And does that have any effect on a woman's decision to have her daughter cut?
We haven't, again, because we don't have any variation, we cannot estimate that progression. We could look at the age at cutting maybe, because one thing that we observe is a correlation between the cutting status, not only of sisters, but of course of mother and sister, for and the type of cut as well. So the few girls who are still cut pharaonic, it's because their mother was cut pharaonic. So there is that element, but you're asking whether, are you thinking because of the cost of cutting that, the number of girls would have an effect, or what is the channel you have in mind?
Well, I don't have any really good hypotheses, except that one of the things about being not the first daughter is that your mother has a chance to observe what happens to you as a consequence of your cutting. Now, of course, she does that with respect to cutting.
Yeah.
But so, as I realized when you said 98% get cut, it's sort of irrelevant.
And sorry, I think that here, if this is whether you experienced complications, this is for the mother and this is for the daughter. And you see that when people are cut pharaonic, both the mothers and the daughter, they experience complications and it hardly improves over time. So there is a generation in between. When you look at Sunna, there's relatively few mothers who have Sunna because these are older and pharaonic was prevalent. And the complications were much lower, 11%. And among the daughters, where it's now more commonly done, it's only 3% of them who had complications. And if you see what type of complication, very high share of these types of complications in pharaonic and very low in Sunna. So I think in that sense, most mothers, whether or not they've seen another girl have complications, are aware that pharaonic is bad news. But it's true that for the new cuts that they're doing, they expect hardly any cost in terms of health, which is one of the reasons why that transition may not be so likely, because the prediction is that you're going to overcome the social cost only if the intrinsic utility benefit is high enough. And now, if you think that Sunna doesn't have intrinsic utility costs, why would you move away from it? Okay, but then another thing in terms of background I want to give you is that if you look at the subclans, which are the majority in the areas where we operate, and of the prevalence of the different types across subclans, you see that this is not an ethnic marker. It's not that some clans do pharaonic, some do Sunna. There is variation across communities. These are 141 small bars, each of them corresponding to one of our villages. And there are some where Sunna is the majority. This merges both mothers and daughters in this graph. And some where pharaonic is the majority. And the green would be the share of uncut in this population. So you see, there's still, this would be the range of communities where we have more room for decreasing the probability that girls are now cut pharaonic. In these other communities, it has kind of disappeared. So as I mentioned, we did a pilot, and before rolling the intervention, and because this pilot revealed high support for Sunna, we decided to work with pharaonic, and we organized this experiment so that there would be a common structure to each and every community, including the control ones. And then the variation was coming in the three types of channels that I discussed. So the common structure was that men and women were gathered in separate. So each village had two meetings, one for men and one for women, because culturally this would be the appropriate thing to do. And in these meetings, the first thing that happened was that you would be given a piece of paper with a yes or no vote, completely anonymous. And you were asked, would you favor abolishing pharaonic circumcision in this village? So you would mark your vote, fold the paper, and put it in a ballot box, okay? And then you were asked, now look around you, and how many people in this meeting do you think would be in favor of abolishing? And the person who got closer to the true proportion would be paid with some air money, mobile money for the phone. And this was the incentive, okay? And this happened both in the treatment and in the control communities. And this is what we're gonna use to know your personal UI, because given that we weren't observing you and we couldn't really identify you, we hope this is as close to truthful revelation as possible. Of course, we cannot be 100% sure, but I'll show you some results with item list responses that are encouraging in this respect. And then this guess is your second order belief. This is how much you think the others are sharing your own view or not. Okay, there was a question back there.
Yeah, like I have one question about the background. So like
About that?
about the background. So were there like any effects of the civil war or the following male scarcity in Somalia?
So this is a period where there's a lot of violence. The areas where we operate are not those where Al-Shabaab was active, because we couldn't have safely sent enumerators there. So to the best of our knowledge, we cannot speak to whether the overall climate had an effect, but at least in terms of local violence, no. Okay, yes.
I have a follow-up question to your design. When you elicit the second order beliefs, you do this about the people within the same meeting, right? And I wonder, to what extent are beliefs about the other gender rather than this context? As a woman, do I care about the men?
Thank you. And I've been sloppy. We elicited both about your meeting and about the other meeting that was going on for both genders, but we only incentivized the one of your own. Okay, so because as you will see in the T1, we directly opened the ballot box, counted the votes so they could see. So we couldn't do this in contemporaneous there. So right now, they are very highly correlated. Right now, what I'm gonna show you for each gender uses the incentivized beliefs. We could try and do it using the other. I don't think we would get very different results, but the result I remember right now is that they're very highly correlated. I think there's even another layer to this, which is not specific to our study, and it's, if you wish, a bit more methodological, at least in my mind, which is when you ask about these questions to men and women, and let's say that I tell you I'm in support, and we see this with domestic violence, we see this with FGC. How much is a woman saying that she's in support because she's truly in support, or because she has internalized the husband's belief? So I don't really know how to think about these as converging or diverging, because there's a sense in which you might reflect already what you expect your husband is going to do. Bottom line, we elicited both and we're using the role. Okay. So here is where the experimental variation starts. After your own value and your prior, in the control group, people are sent home. Nothing happens. In the T1 villages, the person who's leading the meeting opens the box, counts the votes, and says, out of 30 people, 15 said that they want to abandon. This gets announced. And this is what should basically realign your prior with the actual P. In the T2 communities where we do not reveal and open the box, we still pay them because we count them on the side and expose. There will be one person who will know that they were close enough to that guest because they got paid, but they don't learn the value. But in these villages, the person who was leading the meeting basically drew a circle on the ground and said, if you are in favor of abandoning pharaonic FGC, step into the circle, okay? So what is this doing? If you think of what Tostan or other NGOs have done against FGC, they work with families for months or years to find a critical mass of families in a village who will publicly pledge that they are not gonna cut their daughters and they're not gonna let their sons marry cut girls. So this public pledge or public declaration has not been experimentally evaluated, but there are many reports with kind of before, after, or more qualitative data that claim that they are very effective. So in our mind, this was a little bit like a public declaration. Of course, it lacks all the preparatory work where, you know who's going to be in support, you convince them. And this is one of the reasons, as you will see, why in some of the meetings it didn't work, because part of what this is doing is not only telling you that there are 15 people in support, but telling you exactly who these people are, which you don't learn here, okay? So this has both a coordination content, but also an information content, which is the non-anonymity, which to some extent is needed if you want to facilitate collective action, because you need to go who to go talk to engineer a transition away. But because now everybody is seeing you step into that circle, the stakes are quite high and some people might be reluctant to take the first step, okay? So there is an element of coordination, not only in abandoning FGC, but in stepping into the circle, because depending on who gets up first from their chair and goes into the circle, or whether nobody gets up, you can still be stuck in an equilibrium. So that's why I'm saying this is a bit of a rough way of trying this, which is a lab in the field, if you wish, version of those public declaration interventions. But it was the one that we could most easily nest in the structure of the meeting that we were conducting. Yes.
Yeah, wouldn't it be possible to publish names only if there's like 50%
Yes.
that who wants to publish their names, something like that, like a competition out for that?
I think this is, the direction in which platform like Callisto, for example, for gender or other platform go, is that they preserve your anonymity up to when a threshold that can trigger legal action is reached. And I think that would be the way in which I would design something like this. This is a setting with extremely low, if any, literacy, and also where our ability to, I think implement a more complex schema would have been difficult, because what we want from this is that they can follow up and talk to each other. It's not that we are reporting to some authority, okay? So if I want to do what you're suggesting, I have to say, just on this piece of paper, say whether you support it or not. I will need non-anonymity for me in that case, because I need to track you, and hence the potential, misreporting comes into the picture. And then once I reach a certain number, I would need to put you in touch with the others, okay? And so, because if I want these people to collectively act against it, they need to form a group and they need to know who else said that they were against it. You see what I'm saying? We're not, as a research team, going to fight the practice. We're just gonna say the community does it by itself if there is a bottom-up support. And so that scheme, I think, works perfectly when there is some action that you can take without going back to the individuals to network among themselves. It becomes a bit more complex if they need to network. Still feasible, but not in this setting. Anyway, for getting the first stage up, I agree with you that combining a first anonymous action with something else is the way to go. Yes.
Just to understand the design, respondents knew they would be called publicly?
When they come in the meeting?
Yes.
No, we tell them that it's a meeting to discuss, life in the village and health issues. We don't mention FGC when we recruit them because we didn't want to select on the basis of that. And then what they do and what they somehow are expected to do is to fill in that piece of paper and guess, okay? But then after that, there's the circle, and if you don't want to step, you stay seated, but we didn't announce that we were gonna have this. Yes.
Did anything bad happen from organizing this? I mean, I understand what you're trying to do, but it could be that the people who step out are seen as, I don't know, rejecting some religious practice or something, and they could face retribution or something.
So we went back basically 1.5, we did a midline and we did an end line, okay? And nobody reported anything to us. Now, whether something more subtle happened, I don't know. But in terms of getting field reports, we didn't hear of any. But I want to be clear. I think if we had done it with Sunna, it could have been the case. Because Sunna has an overwhelming majority of people who approve it, and there is this religious component. Because we were talking about pharaonic circumcision, I will show you the distribution of people who are still in favor of that, and it's pretty, so that I don't think the risks were as high, but I do agree that something like this in a setting where there is a very high support could expose people and create risks. We started because from that pilot, we understood that there would be kind of a willingness, at least on average, in the community to do that. Yes.
How big is a typical village in your study, and did you have good attendance at these meetings?
So this is a number that we don't really have because there's no census close to the time where we did the study and no other source of data. The attendance at the meeting was about 30 people per gender, so 60 total. There is, I'm pretty sure by construction, some variation in what fraction of the village this represents, but we don't have that number.
Okay.
So yeah, it would have been very useful to have that. Yes.
Do you think your results might have changed if your T2 unit is like participants has to publicly reveal if we are not in favor of?
Great question. We debated among ourselves whether we wanted to push it or stack it in our favor by saying everybody goes in, and if you still want to maintain FGC, you step out, right? The reason we didn't do it is first, we prefer the lower bound than an upper bound. So we wanted to start from a default where everybody is expected to be happy to continue the practice. But also because we thought that this was closer to the real action that they would need to take, okay? So the real action is the practice is there and you need to come forward if you want to do something different. And that's what the Tostan of the world is doing. So if we did it the other way around, it's not very clear what the counterpart policy or reality would have been. But I think the double motivation of being closer to reality and having something that, if anything, works against us was our choice. But I do expect that it would have made a difference what the default option was. Okay, and then in T3, we first open the ballot box, reveal the results of the poll, and then once you've learned how many were in favor or against, you choose whether to step into the survey. So the 3 rounds of data were in late 2018-19, then the midline was about 9 months later, and the end line was almost 2 years later. I told you already that we had about 8,000 people. For the follow-up, we interviewed half of them. The attrition is quite low at end line, still below 5%, and it's balanced by treatment. And the average age at cutting I mentioned earlier is very similar both for Pharaonic or Sunna, and it's around 8 years old. So I'm going to start with the main result, which is the cutting rate. I'm going to start with the pluralistic ignorance first stage, and then I'll give you the cutting rate. This is just beliefs. And you see the cumulative distribution function for what is the actual share of support, which is, remember when you say yes or no, I want to abandon, this is the green dashed line. And you see that in the majority of the meetings, people want to abandon FGC, okay? So there's very few meetings where the share of people who truly express that they still want to keep it is meaningful. While when you look at the expectation, which is the orange solid line, this curve lies to the left. So this means that they expect less support for abandoning than there actually is. And that's the misperception. It's not huge. These curves are not very far apart, but there is some. Now, when it comes, so that just tells you that in principle, by correcting that misperception, people could update beliefs and something could happen, okay? Then the regressions I'm gonna show you are regressions where cutting will be on the left-hand side. We're gonna have the 3 treatment dummies, a number of individual and household level controls, district level fixed effects, and clustering at community level. And the main result is 2 years after our intervention, in our control communities, 4.3 of the girls are cut with Pharaonic. I told you this is going to be a low mean because Pharaonic is already on its way out. Our treatment, the announcement reduces it by 1.6 percentage points. It's only significant at the 10% level. This represents 33% of the mean. Again, it's a low number, but given the health cost associated with this practice, it's still, in terms of welfare, we think a meaningful improvement. Now, what happens to Sunna is that Sunna goes up, okay? Nothing here. This is going to be throughout our results, intermediate. T3 is going to work halfway. T2 is not going to work by itself. Sunna goes up, and what's potentially quite worrisome is that uncut goes down. So what seems to happen, again, at this 1.5 to 2 years interval, is that there's convergence towards Sunna from both sides, which is, by the way, also what theory predicts, is that you can get to it from both sides. However, and it's consistent with this model I told you earlier. However, when you look at what's happening with this, it's basically a reallocation over time. So it's happening that the age at cutting in these communities has gone down a bit. So people have anticipated some cutting choices that they were going to do anyway. And in fact, we have a result on that. And so by the end, at the end of the day, it's not like they were planning to keep them uncut and they've changed their mind, okay? Notice this mean. This mean tells you that in the control group, 46% of girls have Sunna and 48 are uncut. This is not the world in which, this is not what Somalia looks right now. In fact, when for the uncut girl, we asked the parents, she's uncut, but what are you planning to do? Will you cut her or not? And if you cut her, with what type of cut? Only 3.6% of the parents are telling us she will stay uncut, okay? Most of the girls who are uncut because they're too young, at least in the plans of the parents, are still gonna be cut, mostly cut sooner, okay? But now you see that we no longer see that increase in Sunna. If anything, we see that the proportion uncut doubles. It's still very, very low. But this is what I meant when I said it was gonna happen. You anticipated the choice. And it's interesting, we don't know for sure why you decided to anticipate. One explanation we find plausible is that if you are going from a very strong signal of compliance, like a very costly action, which is pharaonic, to something which is less costly, maybe you can signal compliance by doing it sooner. But again, it's a conjecture. We don't have a variable that tells us that was the reason. Yes.
Could it be like bargaining inside the couple? I mean, I don't know, right after the meetings and stuff, maybe
okay.
the wife has a bit more bargaining power to say, let's do sooner, let's transition, and she doesn't want to wait because her husband is now convinced or something.
That's an excellent, we haven't thought.
Yeah, momentum to switch, right? Or...
Yes, it's possible.
So I don't know
again,
if the by gender results can tell you anything.
Yeah,
but yeah, this I don't think.
yes, that's great. Thank you. Okay. Now, I want to spend the remaining time talking about the mechanisms, both on the information on the coordination side and the more robustness work we did. Yes, sorry. Yeah.
I'm imagining these groups and suddenly they are revealed to know that people in their group have different opinions than them. Imagine that I'm someone in the group and I'm very conservative, or I see this as a very important moral or theological standard. If I know that suddenly like my community is threatened by liberalism or this kind of thing, do you think I'll hold more staunchly to my belief, kind of go the opposite way and want to maintain that for my community? Because it seems like the model is like everyone's pulled towards the center, but in this case, I'd be more pulled away because I think I'm like a bastion of like purity of my community, since this is a purity culture conversation.
So I think this would be a fascinating model of backlash. I may let Brian speak on the topic, but or one where you endogenously react. And I've been thinking about this, but I haven't invested in trying to do anything with it. In all of the literature, this thing is fixed. What you're saying is that as P changes, this might change too. And it could change in both directions. It could change because now that many people are in support of Sunna, the sanction becomes less strong in itself, or because I want to really keep the other one alive, the sanction becomes higher. You can, have two different models for that. The truth is that with this evolutionary game theory setup that we've used for the Earth, it becomes a mess if you have S changing with the state. But would that be a good description of reality? I think yes, because I think there is reason to think that people would change the type of sanction in response. I just don't know that there's a way of solving it in a practical way, at least for me. But good point. Yes.
It's kind of a related question. I was wondering more about the people who are leading these meetings. Are they seen as like outsiders coming into the village or like similar ethnic groups?
Yeah. So these are, this is a setting where it's not very easy to work. And so, in fact, the personnel who led the meeting were people who were from the local, not from the village itself, but the Save the Children Somalia office has staff that work in the region. And so they would, I think, have the sensitivity and the way of talking that would be appropriate, but it's still not the chief or whoever else. How they were received, as I said, I didn't hear anything going wrong in terms of field operations, but were people totally comfortable? I'm not sure, okay? One thing I want to say is, and this is also important when we think of these plans to cut. How much do we expect this to be misreported? I think this is a setting where experimental demand effects are, surprisingly low. One, because the norm is actually that you should cut, that you shouldn't cut. And second, because at least what we've done in the other work I did in Sierra Leone, where it's 98% prevalence as well. In that case, we partnered with the Ministry of Health to have health checks as part of the intervention. And in these health checks, the nurse could observe just by, checking for rashes or whatever without any invasive procedure, could see whether the girl was cut or not. And so in that paper, we have the self-reported and the objective measure of cut, which to my knowledge is the only data set that includes both. And the correlation is 0.9 at baseline and remains very similar at endline, not differential by treatment arm. So again, it's a setting where people tell you that they cut. I'm not saying that in places where it's illegal, both Sierra Leone and Somalia still have it as legal. I'm not saying that if you go to a country where it's illegal or where there is a minority cutting, there wouldn't be misreporting. But we think these plans are sort of reliable. And the one thing we can do, again, I don't have the table here, because we have baseline, midline, and endline, we know we ask the plans also at midline. And so we can check between midline and endline how many people told us that they weren't going to cut and then they cut. And it's a handful. I think it's maybe 7 out of the whole thing. So we think it's relatively reliable.
I have a follow-up question to Clemence's, and I think it's about the previous table. So I'm wondering if we need a model of like household work aiding to explain this, because I was thinking this is a world where nobody is uncut. So I'm wondering if hearing other people say that they are against pharaonic can be interpreted as them being in favor of Sunna, because those are the two alternatives, right? So in a way, if I have to decide which type of female genital casting my daughter will get, now it's just more natural for me to choose Sunna because I believe that that's the shared.
So I think that's a very good point. I'm not sure it necessarily requires a bargaining model. It's more about what this signal tells you. And technically, this signal is telling you that pharaonic should go down, but it doesn't, it's silent as to whether the same people who are against it approve Sunna or approve uncut. Empirically, maybe most people will know that they all approve Sunna, so they take it as a signal as Sunna is even a stronger norm now, okay? This is consistent with what we're seeing here. It's not consistent with what we're seeing when we talk about the, although again, we're still not changing the equilibrium. So this is still an equilibrium where Sunna is the dominant norm, but I agree that the signal could be interpreted this way. So let me go to mechanism. I think I will probably only have time to talk about these two. We have some more work here. Let me go fast, actually. If it's okay, I'm going to go without questions for the next 7 or 8 minutes and then leave a few minutes at the end. So in terms of belief updating, this is just what happens to the distribution by treatment. The gray one is the control, the red is the treatment. You see that the T1 shifts the expectation to the right, while T2 and T3 don't, okay? Now, if you do something like a test of Bayesian updating, which is who is moving? Are the people who are underestimating support now changing the decision, or is everybody doing it? Here you see the population split into the people whose priors were lower than the true number. So they expected low support for change, and instead they were in a meeting where the number that was announced was higher. So they got good news for the point of view of abandoning. And you see that in this case, in these sets of, for these sets of individuals, this is actually variation at the individual level because we know your prior. This is where the cutting rate goes down. If your prior was aligned or even more on the other side, there's no effect of our T1. So this is how it should work for pluralistic ignorance. And it's the same also if you look at the plans and not just the actual cutting rate, same exact pattern. How about this coordination instead? Why did it not work? What could have gone wrong? So this is just a scatter plot of the share of people that enter the circle. So that's the one metric that we recorded. We asked the person who was leading the meeting to count, okay? So we know how many people entered in the circle. And this is the share of anonymous votes of people who said that they were in favor of abandoning. So if you just did whatever you voted anonymously, all these points would be on the 45-degree lines. What's happening is that in many meetings, there's a bit of a group pressure to enter the circle, even if you weren't in favor. So if anything, in these places, you're showing more support than there really is. But there's a 20% of communities where actually people were privately in support, but nobody entered the circle. And here is where maybe if we knew that there was an elderly, very conservative person in the meeting, we could say that's what went wrong. We just know that there are these communities, but we don't know who exactly was there. But we tried to do something about it. So first of all, we think it's reasonable to expect that your prior on, thank you, on how many others would be in support is a determinant of you getting up. So here you see the average expected share in support of abandoning. This is the elicited prior, the one that we incentivize. And here you see how the share that steps into the circle. And you see that they're positively correlated. This is done just with the dummy, same message. So what I'm going to show you is not with share stepping into the circle, that's maybe kind of a bit more endogenous. I'm going to split the results by prior, okay? So I'm going to split the results by places where the average guess was greater than the median. So these are the places where actually people started off expecting a lot of support for abandoning. And in these places, T2 is working as well as T1. So there's nothing wrong with the coordination if you think that you're in a sort of a friendly group and lots of people go into the circle. In the places where the average guess was very pessimistic, this is where T2 goes completely wrong. In that case, the cutting rate is still not higher than the control communities, but you can see that those are the ones that drive the zero average effect, okay? And now we are at a place where we can also understand what happened in T3. Why? Because in T3, basically, you could think now that you announce what it is, you're going to reinforce it. But it's also true that if you announce to me that, 28 people out of 30 said that they want to abandon, then you see the circle and nobody's going in, that announcement completely loses credibility, right? So again, what happens to T3? This is the place where the share who stepped into the circle was greater or equal than the vote. So these are the places above the 45-degree line, where basically it worked well. We saw lots of people into the circle. In these places, T3 and T1 and T2 as well are kind of indistinguishable. But in the places where the vote was good, but nobody went into the circle, you see that T3 is not working at all again, okay? So this tells us that kind of a brute force approach to coordination that does not tackle these priors is bound to failure. It's only when the priors align with this public exposure that we're asking people to go through that the coordination can work, okay? So I'm gonna skip this, which are potential other channels that we test. I want to show you one result on social conformity. Again, this is something that we try to bring in because it's not there in the literature, but we think it's interesting to measure the extent to which people are conformist and see whether our interventions affected that as well. Why do I say that? Maybe one could think, if I see high adoption rates, because I see everybody in the village is cut, and then I see that when you announce how many are willing to abandon, most people are willing to abandon, maybe these sanctions, if somebody deviates, are not going to be so high, okay? So there is a possibility for our intervention to basically shift these parameters S. How do I test for that? We asked basically a set of questions that were going to give us sort of a demand for cutting as a function of other people's cutting position. So we said, imagine that 100% of the people in this community cut their daughters. Would you cut yours? Yes or no? And then we say, imagine that 80%, 60%, 40%, okay? And then you tell me. And this function is expected to have a positive slope if people are conformists, because if I cut more when more people cut, this is positively sloped. If I don't care about others, this is a flat line, okay? So in this world, if our treatment affects conformity, we should see that we go from a steep slope to a flatter slope in case people become less conformist, or it tilts in the other way if they became more conformist. So what did we do? This is treatment 1, this is 2 and 3, and you see the control community in the dashed line and the treated ones in the solid line. And T2 and T3 did absolutely nothing to the intercept as well as to the slope. What T1 did was that in the treated, the willingness to cut goes down, but it goes down across the board and the slope doesn't change at all, okay? So it did not make people care less about the opinion of others, but you kind of move along the line. Now you know that there's less people in favor, so you cut less. But it's not that we have dismantled sort of the social pressure infrastructure of the villages, okay? And then I told you I was going to tell you about item list, but we're almost at 25 past. We did do this thing where we hide a sensitive statement, which was you have a daughter who is pharaonic cut. And so with this item list, we're able to estimate the share of people who basically for which the statement is true. And these are the results of the experiment where instead of the self-reported one, you do it with the item list estimation. And it's very encouraging to us that basically we get exactly the same pattern as is with the self-reported. T1 works. In this case, T3 also works better, but T2 doesn't work. Okay, so I'm gonna conclude. We find evidence in line with pluralistic ignorance that P1, which corrected the misperception, was able to shift the beliefs and the decisions for the worst form of FGC. The public declarations per se did not work. There's a table where I show that it did increase communication among households, but it only worked in terms of changing cutting decisions in places where the priors were good. And so we think it's interesting to think about a combination of actions to change second order beliefs and actions to facilitate coordination when you think about changing harmful norms. And one of the dimensions, going back to the issue of, should we maintain anonymity up to a certain point, could be what are the pros and cons of private coordination tools versus these public coordination tools. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions after everybody is released from their obligation.